Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two incredibly creepy and confusing cases of someone's tragic end. In each case, there's one specific element that seems flat out impossible, and yet, according to the people involved, these disturbing things actually occurred. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. On October 5th, 2017, a man named Teki was admitted to the Stellenbosch Provincial Hospital in South Africa with some sort of abdominal issue. Teki was a 61-year-old father of 6 from outside of the town, and whatever the issue was, it was enough for doctors to conclude that he needed surgery, which was the purpose of his visit. The procedure would end up being successful, and afterward, he was transferred to a ward inside the hospital to recover. Now, this wasn't the type of surgery where he'd be able to get up and move around immediately, to put it lightly. In fact, in the hours after the operation, he was incapacitated and unable to move around at all, either as a result of the surgery itself or the medications used to manage his pain. So, a big part of the healing process afterward included bed rest, and the hospital tended to him to make him as comfortable as possible in the process. At around 5:15 on the morning after the surgery, so on October 6th, a nurse came into the room and discovered that his bed sheets needed changing, so she slipped out to grab a fresh set. When she returned, however, Teki was gone. This obviously didn't make sense. There was no way that he could get around on his own, so it was immediately alarming and confusing to the nurse. She then checked the bathroom and the closet in the room, but there was no sign of him anywhere. He also wasn't in the hallway, and none of the other nurses had seen him. It's also not known exactly how long it took for the nurse to retrieve the fresh bed linens outside of Teki's room, but it couldn't have been more than a matter of moments, because according to her, the cart with the linens was right outside the door to his room. It was like Teki vanished into thin air. For some reason as well, his family wasn't notified of his disappearance until later in the day on October 7th, when a hospital staff member called to ask if Teki was home. And considering their understanding of his condition after surgery and the fact that they thought he was being cared for in the hospital, his family was taken aback by this question. Teki's brother Christmas then insisted to the hospital representative that Teki wasn't home, so the hospital was clueless about where he could have gone. And as you might imagine, upon learning he was missing, the family rushed to the hospital and began an extensive search of the grounds for him, but this again turned up absolutely nothing. The next day, the family returned to the hospital to search again, this time with the police, and still no sign of him was found. His whereabouts remained a mystery in the nearly 2 weeks that followed, despite the family's best efforts to find him. One particular element of the search that complicated efforts was that the hospital was under construction at the time, with renovations being done. Because of this, there were areas that were blocked off and unsafe for civilians to be wandering around in, but it was also this construction that would finally reveal where Teki had been the whole time. On October 20th, some construction workers were making progress on the ceiling in one of these cordoned off areas when they made a gruesome discovery. Inside the ceiling was a decomposing body curled up in the fetal position. It was Teki. Now obviously, the location of his body sparked a lot of questions, but there were no answers that could be provided by the hospital. About all that could be done at that point was to perform an autopsy and see if that led to any conclusion about Teki's final moments. When the procedure was complete, the hospital delivered shocking news to his family. The exam determined that Teki did not die of natural causes. Additionally, from what they could tell, he did not end up in the ceiling by himself. Rather, he was placed there after he was dead. Some of the results of these tests performed at the autopsy weren't available at the time the family was notified, but the family alleged that the hospital knew more than it was sharing about the incident. Still, it was clear to both the hospital and the family that Teki's death was the result of foul play, so naturally, police became more involved. Sadly, despite this, no more answers came, and for more than 2 years afterward, the hospital and the family remained at odds. Christmas would even tell the media that regardless of what happened, he believed the hospital was responsible since Teki was left in their care. Christmas also told the media that the police detective assigned to the case simply gave up on the investigation, either as a result of a lack of evidence or interest. Then, as if the case wasn't strange enough on its own, something chilling happened in 2019. At the Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Hospital in Durban, South Africa, a nurse was in the middle of her very first week on the job. And while performing her usual duties, she made her way to a storage closet to retrieve some supplies when she noticed a liquid that had pooled from underneath the closet door. Accompanying this was the horrific and unmistakable odor of death. The nurse then called in security officers, who opened the door and discovered that the fluid on the ground was dripping from the ceiling. Eerily similar to 2 years earlier, inside the ceiling of the storage closet was a body. On May 10th, 2019, just days before this discovery was made, a 63-year-old man named Sando was admitted to the hospital with a broken thigh bone, which he suffered as a result of a wall collapsing on his leg while helping a neighbor with a home project. The next day, his family visited with him, but when they found his bed completely empty the day after that, on May 12th, they asked hospital staff where he was. Almost exactly like Tateki, no one seemed to know. It was initially thought that he was transferred to another hospital to consult with an orthopedic surgeon, but none of the hospitals in the area had any record of him being admitted. And also just like Tateki, Sando was completely immobile. And obviously, most strangely of all, just like Tateki, his body was found stuffed in the ceiling. At first glance, it would appear that the two cases were connected, but the hospitals where these disappearances occurred were 1,000 miles away from one another. That, of course, doesn't preclude the possibility of some sort of tie between them, but what that might be is unknown. These strange incidents in South African hospitals are not without precedent, though. Like, for example, in 2001, a 44-year-old man named Steven was admitted to the Tusong Hospital in Lichtenberg with chest pains. 3 days later, he disappeared with no answers given to the family as to where he went, and 1 week after Steven was admitted, his family was called in. Hospital representatives then handed over Steven's belongings and told the family that he had been discharged, but this was not the case. Afterward, police began investigating Steven's disappearance, and initially nothing was found to indicate where he had gone. Answers wouldn't come for another 5 months when a hospital staff member stumbled on a burned body in an overgrown grassy area behind the hospital. This body was also found to be so badly burned that a DNA test couldn't be performed to confirm that it was Steven. But one of his sisters was shown a shoe that was the same size and type Steven was known to wear at the time. And while Steven's case greatly varies from those of Tateki and Sando, one thing that remains consistent is a lack of answers, particularly from the hospitals. After the failed DNA test on Steven, the family says that the hospital told them that they were going to send some of his bones to a large laboratory for a more detailed test. But after 15 years, the family still hadn't heard a word back from where things stood. As of 2016, they never even received Steven's body so that he could receive a proper burial. Similarly, answers to what happened to Tateki and Sando have eluded their respective families too, and not for a lack of trying. About the only development of note in either case is that a police spokesperson walked back the medical examiner's initial conclusion on Tateki's death. It was initially ruled an unnatural death, but police now say he died of natural causes. Obviously, even if that is the case, it doesn't explain how he ended up in the ceiling of a blocked-off construction area in the hospital. As is often the result of unsolved disappearances and strange cases like this, the true crime internet community tries to fill in the gaps, and these cases are no different. Everything from medical neglect to a common killer and even spontaneous teleportation have been suggested. But, as of the publishing of this video, no further information regarding the deaths of Tateki and Sando has been released, and their cases remain unsolved. So, taken all together, we have 2 separate instances of immobilized hospital patients who ended up deceased and in the ceiling of the hospital they were treated in. In particular, in the case of Tateki, a nurse walked into his room, saw him, walked out, and when she returned, he had simply vanished. Either this did really happen, which obviously is about as strange as it gets, or there is something else that was known by the people in the hospital that was kept secret. In the early morning hours of June 11th, 1994, Deborah Hoyt relaxed in the passenger seat as her husband drove their car along a winding rural portion of Highway 50. This is right near Pollock Pines, California, just east of Sacramento, and the couple was heading to their home in South Lake Tahoe. As the car approached a curve called Bullion Bend that required Deborah's husband to slow down to about 45 miles per hour, she spotted something unmistakable in the road ahead of them. Near the edge of the road, she saw a woman, completely nude, lying near the thin shoulder of the curve. As they got closer to the form lying in the road, Deborah could feel the shock of what she was seeing rise in her, but strangely, they passed the woman without her husband seeming to notice. Immediately, Deborah became almost hysterical as she asked her husband what it was in the road behind them, but he insisted he didn't see anything. So with how worked up Deborah had gotten, her husband suggested they turn back and investigate, but she was adamant that they should just drive to the nearest payphone and let the police handle the situation. It was like whatever she saw had completely terrified her to the point of not wanting to see it again. At the El Dorado County Dispatch, a 911 call came in around 3 a.m. from Deborah frantically describing what she saw on the road and where. Police then immediately responded to the scene based on what Deborah described to them, but when they arrived, they found something curious. There was just no naked woman lying in the road. In fact, it was as desolate as you might expect for such an early hour in a rural area. Police searched anyway on the off chance that she could have gotten up and walked away from where Deborah spotted her, but after performing as thorough a search as they could with the manpower they had on scene in the middle of the night, it soon became clear that there was nothing strange about the area and no one was around. So, calling back into dispatch, the deputies reported finding nothing and abandoned the search, chalking it up to a typical pre-dawn call coming from some crazy person. As the sun began to rise that same morning, County Deputy Rich Strasser was just getting his shift underway when he heard about the report of a woman lying in the road at Bullion Bend. He knew that the officers who initially responded to the scene found nothing to support the claim, but it was just strange enough to make him want to drive out there and check with the benefit of daylight. He couldn't really explain it, but he just had this sneaking suspicion that this call might be related to another case he was working at the time. 5 days earlier, a call came into dispatch with a report of a missing woman and child who were known to be traveling Highway 50. A little while earlier, driving a 1991 Hyundai was 24-year-old Christine Skubish and her 3-year-old son Nick in the passenger seat. This particular trip was a big deal for Christine and Nick. Christine's fiance, who was also her high school sweetheart and Nick's father, lived in Placentia, California, just north of Anaheim, and the mother and son were on their way to join him permanently. At the time, Christine and Nick were living hours away, and she worked several jobs as she studied to become a paralegal so that she could save enough money to move her and Nick to Placentia. Christine was so excited that they were about to be a family finally, and the drive was the culmination of all the hard work she'd put in to make it happen. Before they'd head to Southern California, however, she headed east along Highway 50 to Carson City, Nevada to visit some friends. But, unfortunately, Christine and Nick never made it there. When they were days late for their expected arrival, Christine's friends obviously grew more and more concerned. They then reported her disappearance to police and then set out to search for her, passing out flyers at towns along Highway 50. In the days leading up to dawn on June 11th as well, Deputy Rich had conducted several interviews with members of Christine's family in hopes of determining where she could have gone, and the young mother had remained on his mind ever since. And in hearing the report of a nude woman lying in the road Christine was known to have taken to reach Carson City, there was just something in him that said it was connected to her disappearance. Prior to heading to the scene, Rich stopped by a gas station in Placerville and discovered that Christine and Nick had also stopped there on the night they disappeared. Security cameras at the station showed Christine filling up the car with gas around 2 a.m. and then taking off east. With this information uncovered, Rich hopped back into his police cruiser and headed in the direction of the scene Deborah described to the police just hours earlier. As Rich approached Bullion Bend from the same direction Deborah and her husband were traveling, he slowed down to begin observing the area. Suddenly, he spotted something along the side of the road that could have easily been missed, and it sent a jolt right through him. It was a child's shoe that he estimated to be about the size a 3-year-old would wear. So immediately, he pulled alongside it, threw on the flashing blue and red lights of his cruiser, and got out to take a closer look. Sure enough, his eyes hadn't deceived him, and this discovery would lead to a horrifying scene moments later. Just beyond the shoe, the shoulder ended and a steep 40-foot embankment began. When Rich stepped to the edge of the embankment and looked down, he saw a 1991 Hyundai just like Christine was known to drive. He then ran down the embankment to the car, but the hill was so steep that he lost his footing and tumbled down much of the way. When he finally came to a rest, he got up and rushed the car, and he could immediately see that the roof had been completely torn off and there were trees brought down by the car accident on top of the vehicle. He then reached the driver's side and looked in, and there was Christine in the driver's seat, still buckled in, and very clearly she had passed away. He then turned his attention to the passenger seat and saw Nick. He was curled up in the fetal position, but strangely he was without clothing and unbuckled. Rich also noticed that his skin had a bluish hue to it and his heart sank. He then went around the car to the passenger seat, and in getting a closer look at Nick, Rich was sure he was dead too. But as a formality, Rich reached into the car and checked Nick, looking for any sign of a pulse. To his great surprise, he could feel the child's heartbeat, and his immediate reaction was to shout his name. Just a second later, in that moment, Nick deeply inhaled as if to sigh. He was still alive. Rich then immediately got on his radio and called in to report the car and Nick's need for emergency medical attention. Police, EMTs, and firefighters then converged on Bullion Bend, and Nick was rushed to the hospital. Making sure Nick was given the best chance to survive was Rich's first priority, but once the ambulance had taken him away, a clear picture of what happened began to form, and it was heartbreaking. Based on the sighting of Christine at the gas station in Placerville, she likely reached Bullion Bend around 3 a.m. on the morning of June 6th. Again, it's the kind of place that requires a driver to slow down to safely take the turn, but based on where Christine's car ended up, it appeared she made no attempt to brake or turn the wheel. So police concluded that she must have fallen asleep behind the wheel as she approached the bend, which resulted in the car flying down the embankment. Evidence at the scene indicated that the car barrel rolled its way to the bottom, striking trees and bringing them down along the way. Weirdly, when Rich discovered the car and examined Christine, he noticed several lacerations that would have certainly been life-threatening, yet there was little blood in the car. But that, combined with the fact that she was still strapped into her seat, the medical examiner concluded that she died on impact from internal injuries. Nick, however, survived the violent wreck and spent the next 5 days inside the car next to his mother. His survival, obviously, was completely improbable. Despite the stop at the gas station and the long journey she was embarking on, Christine didn't have any food or water among her belongings in the car. On top of that, this area of California was experiencing a heat wave that had temperatures climbing in excess of 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius during the day. This seems to explain the fact that he was found without clothing on, but at the same time, the temperatures plunged at night. When Nick was discovered, he was also suffering from such severe dehydration and hypothermia that doctors at the hospital estimated he only had about 2 hours left to live if he hadn't received immediate medical attention when he did. Sometime later in the hospital, as Nick recovered, he started to remember things about the accident and his ordeal, but more than anything, he kept asking about where his mother was. For those first few days after he was found, Christine's parents didn't tell Nick that his mother didn't survive the accident, but hospital counselors advised them that it'd be best to break the news to him as soon as possible so he could begin the grieving and healing process. But, unable to find the words to tell him themselves, Nick's grandparents would let the counselors tell the 3-year-old the horrible news, and it understandably crushed him. Now, while this might seem like the conclusion of Christine and Nick's story, the mystery only deepened. When he was told that she had died at the time the accident occurred, Nick's response was strange. He insisted that his mother was taking care of him in the car and even said that she slept with her hand across his chest. This was chalked up to the imagination of a very traumatized child, but it was far from the only peculiar fact surrounding the case, and many questions remained. Like, for example, what happened to the naked woman Deborah says she saw lying in the road? Why didn't her husband see what was so obvious to her that night? And how did Nick's shoe end up on the side of the highway? Or even more incredibly, how did Nick survive those 5 days without food and water? These were questions that baffled police, namely Rich, who is now extremely close to the case. Several theories have been presented that might explain this, and we'll start with what's believed to be the most likely scenario. At some point in the early morning hours of June 11th, Nick, who was already naked in response to the daytime heat, crawled out of the car and climbed the extremely steep embankment to get help by dropping his shoe off on the side of the road. When he reached the top of the hill, he collapsed from exhaustion, which is when Deborah and her husband were entering Bullion Bend, meaning it wasn't a woman Deborah saw, it was Nick. Then, at some point between his sighting and the police arriving on the scene, Nick climbed back down the embankment and got back into the car. This theory, however, doesn't explain everything. When asked for a physical description of what she saw, the details Deborah provided matched Christine. But obviously, it would have been impossible for Christine to be the woman Deborah saw because she had been dead for 5 days at that point. In addition, if you recall, the angle of the embankment was so steep that Rich struggled to stand his feet and he fell much the way down, and he was a grown man at full strength. In interviews with reporters following the discovery of the car, Rich was initially unwavering in his belief that there was no way a 3-year-old weakened by 5 days without food or water could have climbed to the top of the embankment. As more of the mystery surrounding the case became known, however, he would walk back that statement and eventually tell the media that Nick had indeed climbed up the embankment. This was apparently supported by his being covered in scratches and a skin reaction from coming in contact with poison oak. Obviously, many people found this to be a strange reversal after he was so insistent that it was impossible. Also, if Nick did in fact climb the embankment, people have also called into question that doing so in order to leave a shoe behind might require thinking that's more advanced than a 3-year-old is capable of. Not only that, but the deputies who initially responded to the call about the naked woman in the road did not report seeing a shoe along the shoulder. This also all but rules out the possibility that the shoe somehow flew out of the car at the moment of the accident. All of these questions lead us to a second theory, and for the record, this is a far more outlandish theory that people have put forward that I typically wouldn't include, but felt was interesting if nothing else. It's been suggested that the woman Deborah saw that night was indeed Christine, but it was a spiritual manifestation of her. In other words, Deborah saw Christine's ghost. After he was rescued, Nick continued to insist that his mother took care of him during the ordeal, and had it not been for Deborah calling in to report seeing a naked woman in the road, Rich never would have had a hunch about searching the Bullion Bend area. If that never happened, Nick never would have been found in time to save his life. To this day, in interviews she did with reporters, Deborah said she believes that what she saw that night was in fact Christine's ghost desperately trying to call attention to the area so that Nick could be saved. Whatever happened that night in June 1994, Nick would go on to make a full recovery. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. I actually use so many of the stories all of you suggest, so thank you all so much for your great suggestions. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.